Westeros is a complex and dangerous place filled with political intrigue, gruesome battles, and powerful magic. But George R.R. Martin's carefully crafted world connects with viewers on a deeply human level. The main characters are dynamic and flawed, each facing their own moral demons and dilemmas. They're not heroes, they're not villains, they're real people with real hopes, ambitions, beliefs. And though the themes explored in the series are at times dark and usually thought-provoking, they're always grounded in reality, like when the series explores the consequences of power, ambition, and loyalty. So when Lord Velaryon suggests to Queen Rhaenyra that they blockade King's Landing by sea, he does so not because in some abstract sense it's better for the plot, but because that's what a real person might do. It makes economic sense. And in a world so intricate, a world where the people, politics, and economics feel so real, audiences are inspired to craft their own worlds and to wonder what could have been. How would the world look if the characters were different, if their ambitions changed, if the bedrock of their beliefs were suddenly to crack? This video will assess the economic and political realities of House Targaryen and ask that very question. What could have been? How could the mighty Targaryens have sustained their dynasty, or built it to even greater heights? We'll of course play by the rules of Martin's world in Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon. There will be spoilers for both shows, though we won't spoil anything between the season finale of House of the Dragon and the first season of Game of Thrones. But we will dig into the tactics and strategies the Targaryens could have employed to maintain their power, or to amplify it. This is The Invisible Lens. Westeros is full of different cultures, religions, and political factions. The titular Game of Thrones pits the houses of the 7 regions against each other in a battle royale for power and influence.
Westeros is your bog-standard kind of feudalist agrarian economy. It's not particularly advanced, is inspired a lot by the way that the European medieval economy was organized. Essentially, it's a very top-down structure, but there's also a lot of independence for local landowners to exert influence.
This top-down structure results in big differences in ideology and culture among the houses, and they're often in opposition to each other, with the fate of the world resting on the outcome of the game. So the Game of Thrones becomes a match of maneuvering, alliance, and negotiation, each house with its own strategy and having to navigate the murky waters of Westerosi politics to ensure its own survival.
When you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. There is no middle ground.
Indeed, to survive, each house's first concern must be economic. And although there are some craft markets in Westeros, its resources are primarily agricultural.
When you look at Westeros, a lot of the ancestral seats have some great resources. Casterly Rock is a castle in a literal gold mine. It's teeming with wealth. The Reach is an incredibly fertile land, and Highgarden, the seat of House Tyrell, is the epicenter of that on a very fertile river.
But House Targaryen faces a unique problem, one of its own creation, to be sure, and we'll get there. But the Targaryens also face a challenge all the houses face.
Maintaining a monarchy is extremely difficult because you lack a lot of sources of legitimacy. You're not elected, you're not given, any legitimacy from the people.
And as if the standard struggles of maintaining a monarchy weren't enough, one of the Targaryens' sound strategic decisions actually comes back to bite them. They choose to live in an area that's easy to defend, but has few other upsides.
Dragonstone is a volcanic rock in the middle of the sea. There are no natural resources there. The land isn't really that fertile. It's kind of far away from a lot of the rest of Westeros because it's just an island. There's not anything that they really gain from having that seat. They only settled there because it was volcanic and it was a good place to keep dragons.
The Targaryens' decision to prioritize defense and dragons demonstrates Martin's skill for humanizing his characters. Martin is tapping into a storytelling tactic that goes back to Aristotle and his book Poetics, where he defined the tragic hero. Tragic heroes, from Oedipus to Jay Gatsby to Severus Snape, have some flaw, known as hamartia, that brings about their own downfall. In Shakespeare's plays, the hamartia is often hubris, think Macbeth, and for the Targaryens too, it's hubris mixed with over-sentimentality for their source of power that cracks the foundation.
You have to go back to an event called the Dance of the Dragons, which was the Targaryen Civil War, to address why the Targaryen influence in Westeros declined so drastically. Because over the period of about 7 or 8 monarchs, the Targaryens went from being the strongest force in the world to being a shadow of its former self.
By the time it was over, thousands were dead. And it was a disaster for the Targaryens as well. They never truly recovered.
And a lot of that is wrapped up in their inability to proactively raise income outside of taxing the local wardens and the local lords, and also the loss of their strongest allies and also their strongest military weapons, that being the dragons. So in I think it's the first episode of House of the Dragon, Viserys takes Rhaenyra to the side and has just announced that he's going to make her his heir. And he gives this speech about the role of dragons in the history of the Targaryen dynasty.
The idea that we control the dragons is an illusion. They're a power man should never have trifled with. One that brought Valyria its doom. If we don't mind our own histories, it will do the same to us. Targaryen must understand this to be king. Or queen.
Up until this point, dragons have been an incredible resource to the Targaryens. It's the only reason that the Seven Kingdoms are united, because they had 3 huge dragons, and they've only been producing more. There are more dragon riders in Westeros during King Viserys' reign than there are at any other period of time. The common notion is that Targaryens are just kind of born with this genetic trait of being able to train dragons and control them and tell them when to fly and breathe fire, and that's aided them massively. But Viserys here is actually saying that we don't control the dragons, it's just an illusion, because the power of the dragons is a force of nature, basically. The Targaryens aren't necessarily sure what they're doing.
What makes the tragic hero even more tragic is that the audience can often see his downfall in advance. We all know Oedipus's fate before even he does. And that's true of the Targaryens too. We know they'll lose the Iron Throne, but we also understand something fundamental about their dynasty that goes back to their choice to live on Dragonstone.
The Targaryens don't really produce anything. Dragonstone is not a particularly fertile or rich seat, but the houses around them, particularly the Westerlands and the Reach, and even Dawn to some extent, are massive providers of income, culture, and food and wealth. And from the Targaryen standpoint in King's Landing, it makes much more sense for them to just sit there and tax all of the areas around them and take in their resources.
Here, Martin subtly works in economic theory for the Targaryens. They've made their bed on rocky, volcanic Dragonstone, and now they have to lie in it, while their competitors put natural resources to use. But the Targaryen kings and their allies have a cunning scheme to gain wealth anyway.
It has asserted itself as almost the divine right of rule in Westeros, and it doesn't necessarily feel the need to generate wealth on its own terms or through own legitimate means, because it can simply exert taxation and take resources from the houses around them.
Everyone says Targaryens are closer to gods than to men, but they say that because of our dragons. Without them, we're just like everyone else.
This dovetails with the stationary bandit theory, Economist Mansur Olsen is credited as the originator, but really, it goes back to German sociologist Franz Oppenheimer in 1908. Basically, the theory goes, one tribe defeats another, and instead of then moving to a new area and trying to defeat still others, they say, actually, it's more profitable to just stay here and slowly but surely tax the work and wealth from the conquered people.
The Targaryens have established a code of laws over the years that stops the interlying houses kind of fighting against each other and disputing their resources, because the Targaryens have ultimate authority. This kind of stops the other houses from fighting within each other for resources, but it gives the Targaryens the monopoly on theft through which they can steal resources from the houses. This kind of model proved very successful for quite a long time because they were able to draw a lot of wealth from particularly the Lannisters.
And as we all know, a Lannister always pays his debts.
There was a lot of focus on stopping infighting and allowing the Targaryens to establish themselves as the only party that had any right and ability to steal resources.
Martin foreshadows the downfall of the Targaryens, their peripetia, or the hero's sudden reversal of fate, through the contrast between House Targaryen and House Velaryon, and especially the latter's leader, Corlys.
So in this scene, we're in High Tide, which is the ancestral seat of House Velaryon. And this is Corlys speaking with Daemon Targaryen about their culture and shared history.
But unlike the Targaryens, we were no dragon lords. For centuries, my house had to scratch out an existence from the sea with grit and luck. When I ascended the Driftwood throne, I knew what I wanted. So I went out and seized it. Unlike every other Lord of the Realm, I can say that I built my house's high seat with the strength of mine own back.
Corlys's rise to power and the fortunes of House Velaryon is probably one of the single greatest increases in wealth in such a small amount of time that Westeros has seen. So Corlys went out with a small fleet of ships and sailed across the world on 9 voyages. And through these voyages, he amassed such a huge amount of wealth and power and influence that he was able to raise a massive castle called High Tide, which we just saw in that scene, filled with, trinkets and objects that he's collected over his voyages. But he also brings back spices, silks, all of these incredibly exotic things. A lot of them are from Yi Ti, which hadn't been really associated with Westeros before, but this is kind of the Asian parallel on the other side of Essos, which has a lot of exotic things that the Lords of Westeros want. So Corlys establishes these incredibly valuable trade routes for House Velaryon and to that extent the Crown, because at this moment he is the master of ships on the small council. And so his is a real success story of going out, start finding his own way, finding his way to make money and building from the ground up something that he can be incredibly proud of. And he's a very proud man of what he's done, because before his house wasn't that significant. It was a small island off the Blackwater Bay, and there really wasn't much to talk about with House Velaryon. And it's an incredible position by the time he is finished with it.
In establishing Corlys Velaryon as this self-made man, Martin also establishes a clear contrast with the Targaryens. The lesson for the House of the Dragon is implied and understood through that dichotomy.
And the Targaryens could really learn from this because they aren't proactive. They are a really reactive, kind of stagnant house, and it's really only, Aegon the Conqueror who founded the kingdoms who has ever looked at a situation and said, okay, what can we do with this? What can we take for our own, and how can we make money from this? So the big thing that the Targaryens could learn from the Velaryons is, have a bit of proactivity in securing your income, make your way in life, and really try your best to get out there and, bring home the dough, basically, because the Velaryons will get very good at that, and the Targaryens have always just kind of sat on their laurels.
The importance of wealth in the Game of Thrones cannot be overstated. It shapes the course of the game. It can be used to purchase weapons, hire mercenaries, and bribe individuals to gain favor and leverage. Wealth can also be used to buy loyalty, as those who are able to offer more money than their rivals might be able to build a larger army or attract more allies.
When the Queen proclaims one king and the Hand proclaims another, whose peace do the Gold Cloaks protect? Who do they follow? The man who pays them.
Furthermore, wealthy characters are often able to purchase land, build fortifications, and establish castles that can be used as strategic bases of operation.
Your Grace.
Your fleet is one of the realm's most important assets, Lord Corlys. But you must understand, as king it is my obligation to avoid war until such time it is unavoidable.
None among us desire open war.
One of the big problems in the history of the dynasty is that the Velaryons have a bit of a fall from grace. They lose a lot of their financial power, they lose their naval forces, a lot of the trade routes that they rely on through the Stepstones get messed up through a series of wars. The trade with Essos becomes less reliable, and so the loss of the Velaryon alliance and the strength of House Velaryon is another big part of why the Targaryens found themselves without allies and without resources during the last days.
The theme of wealth creation is so pervasive that Martin emphasizes it throughout the timeline of both House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones. And above all, the series illuminates trade as the key to wealth creation.
So let me explain my position, little princess. Unlike you, I do not have exalted ancestors. I make my living by trade, and I judge every trade on its merits.
A lot of the time, because the only way to trust someone is to have almost a hostage of some kind. A financial deal or an economic deal or just an alliance was sealed by having one person from your house marry someone from the other house.
There must be someone at the Iron Bank you can speak to, come to some arrangement.
The Iron Bank is the Iron Bank. There is no someone. You can't run from them, you can't cheat them, you can't sway them with excuses. If you owe them money and you don't want to crumble yourself, pay it back. Vesting the Tyrells in the crown will help a great deal in this respect.
They also mentioned the Iron Bank of Braavos, which is this monolithic financial institution based in the city of Braavos in Essos, on the northern coast of Essos. And the Iron Bank is a terrifying structure. It is, very reminiscent of international banks in the modern day. There's no really bargaining with them, no dealing with them. They will take what they're owed. The saying is that the Iron Bank will always have its due. And one of their techniques in this world is to finance the opponents of people who don't pay their debts to the bank. And that actually happens later in the show, when Stannis Baratheon, who is at this point leading a rebellion against the throne, which is held nominally by Tommen Baratheon, who's a bastard of the Lannisters.
Who's the real power in King's Landing?
Sir Davos.
Humour me.
Tywin Lannister.
How old is Tywin Lannister?
67.
67, and when he dies, who's in command? A half-grown boy, the product of incest. Cersei Lannister, a queen whose people despise her. Jaime Lannister, a man best known for killing the king he was sworn to protect. When Tywin's gone, who do you back?
That is a problem for another time.
Begging your pardon, I think it's a problem for now. There's only one reliable leader left in Westeros. Stannis. He's got the birthright. He's in his prime. He's a tried and tested battle commander, and he doesn't just talk about paying people back, he does it.
The bank actually supports Stannis because they think Stannis is the only way that they can get revenge on the Lannisters for all of this debt that they're not paying, and also for them to kind of re-get some of their investment, because it's very important to the bank that they get back whatever they've put in it. They're a very numeric institution. They're not really one for petty politics. They will just back the side that they think will give them the smartest financial outcome.
In this way, while Martin doesn't spell it out explicitly, he makes it clear. Wealth and trade are crucial, and the Targaryens don't create enough of it. He lays the groundwork for the Targaryens' downfall in other ways, too. As far back as the Dance of the Dragons, he establishes dragons not only as the chief source of Targaryen power, but also the symbol of it.
the dragons were essential to the Targaryen economic power. They were the only way that they could really consistently threaten to obtain resources, and that was fundamental to the founding of the Seven Kingdoms. There's this event called the Field of Fire during Aegon's conquest, where Balerion the Black Dread, which was Aegon's dragon, which is slightly larger than Vhagar in the show, kills the largest standing army Westeros has ever seen, the combined armies of the Reach and the Rock, and they are all completely incinerated. The easiest way to explain it is to compare it to the bombing of like Hiroshima and Nagasaki as this massive show of force that then resonates throughout history as a disincentive to disobey the crown, essentially. And the Targaryens never really had to use dragons again because they had the threat, and everyone knew in culture what dragons were capable of. And it's only really after dragons die out and so many are killed during the Civil War that people really start to question whether or not they can get away with disobeying the Targaryen monarchy.
So Martin's plot hits the Targaryens with a double-edged sword, but really they hit themselves. They are slow to accept the slippage of their power and the changing perception of it, while also sentimentally clinging to it. That sentimentality becomes a big problem as the dragon's massive consumption of resources comes into focus. Drogon, for example, consumes between 250,000 and 400,000 calories per day to be in fighting shape, which equals the intake of about 200 men. In the era of House of the Dragon, the Targaryens have 17 dragons, some much larger than Drogon. That's equivalent to a standing army of at least 3,000 men they're sustaining, and for a medieval society, that's a lot. The real-life Manhattan Project cost nearly $23 billion in 2020 money, over just a 7-year period. So what the Targaryens are doing, essentially, is like if the US's territory were only barren Nevada wasteland, and yet they continued to spend precious resources on some kind of indefinite Manhattan Project, even decades after World War II ended.
They have a few houses that are sworn to them because of their ancestral seats on Dragonstone, but beyond that, there's very little manpower to the Targaryen dynasty. And the lack of economic power means that they can't really raise an army from sellswords or free companies in Essos if they reach crisis. So the answer is definitely yes. The Targaryens lacked a lot of economic independence from the houses surrounding them, and that was a massive damage to their ability to properly counter threats, as we saw in Robert's Rebellion.
The Targaryens continue to face rebellion threats and continue to build massive standing armies and fleets, using their dragons to devastating effect in battle. But the constant state of warfare takes a toll, and the never-ending conflicts strain the economy and the people. The Targaryens' reckless use of resources and their obsession with warfare clearly contribute to their downfall, a downfall of their own making. They squander their wealth and resources on military campaigns and the upkeep of their dragons, leaving little for trade or for the development of their own kingdom.
The biggest thing the Targaryens could have done to remain in power is to establish an independent way of making money, because realistically, they were always going to run into a mad king or a ruler that was going to be unpopular with the locals. And they could have stopped that by establishing independent sources of income. The easiest way to do this would probably have been through establishing greater trade from King's Landing with Essos. They also should have looked into gaining greater money from things like Dragonstone, which is their ancestral seat. At this point, the Targaryens are holding on to a clutch of dragon eggs, which are worth incredible amounts of money. For pretty, sentimental reasons, the Targaryens have an obsession with reviving dragons and maybe bringing them back into the world because that's their symbol and where their power comes from. But they could have made a lot of money, and it would have made a lot of economic sense to monetize their culture and maybe sell off some of these eggs, because that would have given them enough money to tide them over for a really long time.
The Targaryens' downfall is a cautionary tale of the dangers of relying too heavily on military might and wasting resources on unnecessary short-term wars. without properly weighing the long-term consequences. And with an Aristotelian flourish, the series reveals those consequences and hammers the message home. The anagnorisis, the moment the tragic heroes realize they're responsible for their own downfall, comes at the hands of the very symbol of their power.